Distinguished guests, Mrs. Sailesh Haribhakti, our local advisory board members, fellow bankers, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the generous introductions. I was in the fantasy movie when Mrs. Sailesh was trying to propel what likely to happen in the next 20-odd years. Extraordinary vision. It's a huge convergence in the financial inclusion. I was in International Monetary Fund meeting in October. India was a telling story. India was the only country widely talked about the extraordinary feat of financial inclusion, especially on the Prime Minister Dandan Yojana scheme, how India is transforming into digital ecosystems. Of course, there are pains, short term. The long term we are here to gain. That's the conceptions global governance have propelled on what is the direction of India. We are proud to be part of this citizenship. Coming to the global framework, extraordinary set of happenings on account of re-regulation is happening. Things have changed. 2016 has been an extraordinary year. Yesterday I was in London. I was in Sky News. If you look at the set of questions which they asked me, you will get surprised. Perhaps I'll share, and along with the questions which I have answered today to the press in the afternoon, then we have done the changing dynamic session. Is the global growth is going to be contained by the reverse engineering which we are seeing on account of Brexit or the newly elected president of the United States? That one question. Is the global trade is going to be impaired with the impending challenges on Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? There's another question. Is the advanced economies are going to be disintegrated in terms of EU fraternity to start with? Is euro as a currency will be dismantled or not? Right questions, because you have the monetary policy which is centralized by the European Central Bank. Fiscal policy is very, very different, deviant from the Maastricht Treaty. Is the financial markets are gambling grounds? What's the reality for financial stability? Is the emerging markets are going to sustain as the economic engine of the world when we see gone are the days when China used to produce consecutive 9% over 30 years. India used to propel in extraordinary momentum. Now with demonetization, what is likely to come for the emerging markets? What's the role of the BRICS in substance? What is likely to happen with the deflection of commodity prices for the Gulf? What is the opportunities or challenges we are going to have with the change in phase of the financial economies converting as real? Real economies are redefining as substance. What is the possibility of a third world war? These are the questions which were put through. These questions, however silly it sounds, it is a food for thought. Think about it. If you look at the economic momentum since 2008, it has not grown. We have gone down in terms of overall sustainability. We used to have 3.8 to 4% growth. Now, we are struggling to oscillate between 3 to 3.2%. IMF has predicted 3.6% for this year, 2016. Last year, October, when IMF met, they have revised it twice in spring meeting in Washington in May, and again, a couple of months before in 2016. Possibly we may do between 3.3 to 3.4% in aggregate terms. If G20 decisions are executed, we might end up in 3.5% for next year, not necessarily this year. So what has changed in the last 7, 8 years, if you look at it, it is only liquidity. Liquidity was recognized as a major problem in 2008 when the housing market collapsed, when the asset price deflation started. We all have recognized it was all right, investment banks were producing structured products as long as where asset price was inflating. You had collaterals and also additional collateral in the name of subprime. When the asset price deflation started, we realized you don't have collateral for the prime property, forget about subprime. The AAA gilted securities were completely challenged. Auditors were wrong, rating agencies were wrong, regulators were wrong, light switch regulations have failed, extraordinary set of calamities in the global map. And we said, we'll print money. America started first, trillions of dollars they put on quantitative easing model to inflate the world. Housing market started recovering, stock market was recovering, hot money was transcending borders, and we had extraordinary set of recognition that money has to be printed by every single central bank. The monetary policy comes from the central bankers. The fiscal policy comes from the finance minister. Accommodative monetary policy cannot fix beyond definition. So quantitative easing, number 1 was printed, 2 was done, 3 was done, trillions, over 12 trillion was printed by the United States. If America can print money, European Central Bank has to print money and inflate. Reflation was a real answer when they were facing. Japan has to come out with Abenomics in 2012 because if Bank of England can print, European Central Bank can print, and again, America could print, why not Japan? They were technically in recession for 30-odd years. They have to pull out, weaken the currency, export-driven economy, and they have to do it. And they did it. And they started seeing the economic momentum. That's precisely what's happened over the last 8 years. G7 has become G8, G8 has become G20. Plenty of decisions were promulgated, including containing the parallel economy, fixing the offshore tax havens. And that's precisely, we all recognize today, demonetization in global terms, in global governance, is not an ordinary issue. Perhaps it may not be visible for a common man. He is going through extraordinary set of stress, but long-term solution lies in recognizing India is not a country of poor substance. India has got poor people. India can come out of extreme poverty. India can withstand the economic momentum and sustainability in real order and make sure this century belongs to India. That's the real recognition visionaries have got, and that's precisely the character depiction in the form of projection for 3035 Mr. Sailesh was trying to articulate. I compliment his thoughts first. Look at the global economic momentum. Advanced economies still reeling under pressure. America hiked the interest rate a couple of days before. This is the second time in the last 8 years. What has changed? Jobless claims have reduced. They are achieved 4.6% as jobless claims. The growth is still less than 2%. Possibly next year they may do between 2 to 2.2%. Purchasing power parity is improving. But can they sustain back on track the economic momentum originally which they envisaged? The answer is no. We live in an interconnected, interdependent world. We have to understand financial economies have to convert into real. That's the issue. We have bigger challenges, not only in America, Europe. For the reasons which I mentioned, monetary policy is centralized, and enlarged Europe has breached all the regulatory alignment required. The gross debt to GDP has outlined the basic, very existence of monetary policy. Countries and continents, individuals and institutions who have lived beyond their means have to pay a price. That's the moral story. That's the ethical legislation which is coming up. That is why the United Nations has to reset the button. How do you eliminate extreme poverty? How do you bring in gender equality? How do you bring in universal health care? How do you enforce universal education? How do you bring in sustainability to global warming and climate change? The Millennium Development Goals have been outlived. What was proclaimed as 15-year policy framework by global governance were nullified, and they came with Sustainable Development Agenda in September. So how do you bring in sustainability to the world? By being real, by becoming true and fair. When it comes to global governance, we have to have a functional makeup where politics and economics have to converge. That's the bottom line. If America is not scoring, Europe is not scoring, then who is scoring? Look at Brexit. I got my Resident Representative Richard Whitening. Can I ask you, can you pass on the mic? What's happening in, Richard, in London now? Is it a soft Brexit or let's be interactive. Is it a hard Brexit or soft Brexit? We were together a couple of days before. Wells Fargo organized an investment conference. I was very much there in London. Can you pass on the mic? You have got a hand mic there? Yes. Tell me what is happening in London. If the new government is coming to terms?
Still, it's all politics at the moment. And as a consumer, as a debtor, we're all waiting to see exactly what is happening. And it's now taking a pathway through politics. So is it soft? Is it hard? We're still not a year into this, so come June next year, we'll have more idea. It's not easy. It's not easy. It's a very emotive subject.
You have trade negotiations to be recasted. You have immigration as a policy. Extraordinary set of issues. Imagine the global trade today is half of the GDP. 1.7% is what the forecast for next year. This year is still less. Ideally, pre-globalization, it was double of GDP. Imagine if 3.4, 3.5% is the global growth which we envisage for next year. You have to have 7% as trade growth, incrementally. And that's not visible. Whether you were merchandising it, servicing, whatever you say, if trade negotiations have to be recasted, the consequential impact is wild. Referendum has been dictated now. In substance, when it comes to pragmatic negotiations with the EU, there are conditions which are cumulative. So Britain is under stress as well. So their growth, if you look at it next year, it's 1.2% as against 1.6%. So people expect a downward revision. Look at the emerging markets. Russia is under stress. Russia, on account of Crimea annexations, we had bigger issues. The political sanctions have impacted, irrespective of the fact they've additionally pumped oil from 8 million barrels to 10.4 million barrels a day. But still, technically, they are contraction. And possibly again, next year they may move to 1%. Look at Brussels. That's again in contraction, 0.5%. Next year they may grow 0.5%. This year, minus 3.5% is the contraction. That's Russia for you. China, which I mentioned, extraordinary economic engine of the world, today is reeling under stress. 6.2% is the projection for next year. That's why Mr. Sailesh was telling that India is a growth story which is visible. It's not an exaggeration. So you can look at the IMF indicators, which is released, is the public information. 7.6% is the projections. Demonetization may impact for the first 2 quarters of next year. Possibly, it will. Because you are aligning with the digital ecosystems. The financial inclusion has got long-term values. The e-governance has got long-term values. That will have definite impact in short term. Unless access to the digital systems are fully provided, circulation becomes inactive for a while, you will have disruption to the service standards. But that's part of the engagement process. But long term, we stand to gain. So India is going to score still definitely over 7%. That's the overall macroeconomic growth. Looking at the Gulf states where I come from, last year beginning, we started oil price going down. We started from $100, it moved down to $60. This year beginning, we had oil touching $26. The deflection on the oil price is not necessarily on account of exponential growth in terms of supply. There's no supply glut to the extent of 100% reduction for the price. Or demand has gone down so much, it should regress over 60, 70%. So what has changed is currency as well as supply and demand. Additional supply to the minimum, Iraq is propelling the maximum. And again, Iran is, post-sanction, we had disruption to the service. Now supply chain has been revamped, and they're also pumping additional 4 million barrels of oil. So these triggered additional quantum. Gas supply or oil supply now is abundant, but still nothing dictates you to have a regression of 50, 60% on the oil or gas, but it has happened. What does it mean to the Gulf states? Well, gone are the days when we used to have over 2 trillion. 2 trillion is the GDP for 6 Gulf states. And we used to have current account and fiscal surplus. Current account used to be over 20, 25% of the GDP as surplus. Fiscal used to be between 7 to 8%. Today, all the Gulf states are running a fiscal deficit. At least 3 of the Gulf states are running in current account deficit because of the expansionary fiscal policy, because of the urban development. I'll come to you in a minute what sort of opportunity crops up on account of all this changing dynamics in the world, how India can leverage. That's the purpose of the session. If you look at the Gulf states, from over $2 trillion of GDP, it has moved down this year, possibly taking oil at 46. That's the average price I foresee, taking into account the current developments between OPEC and non-OPEC, and also output cut by the OPEC countries, maybe 1.4 trillion. So it's a straightforward regression of $600 billion is the downward GDP productivity. It means you will have a 4 to 5% current account deficit, which is over 50 billion, is the deficit in current account. Fiscal deficit is huge. Some countries like Saudi Arabia, which was AA rated country, where 20% of the world oil was produced by one country. If you look at the Gulf state, 40 to 45% of the world oil comes from the Gulf states. 20, 22% of the world gas comes from the Gulf states. That's why they are rich in terms of overall economic fundamentals. But they have to go through a downward trend. They have to go through fiscal deficit and current account deficit. That's extraordinary change. Then came the US election. I was in Bloomberg on October 6th. It was a very controversial interview because while wide-ranging subject was put to my purview, and I answered that US President-elect now, he was a then candidate, when I saw the sort of motherhood statement he was making, challenging the climate change, challenging the TPP, challenging the overall Chinese economy. It was a worrisome issue because the global growth is on account of globalization. When economic nationalism is enforced, however practical or pragmatic it is in terms of policy making, we don't know. But that's the centerpiece of his core sustenance. And eventually, he got elected now. He's president-elect on January 20th. Perhaps you will see what sort of policy reorganization comes out. But if you look at the overall space which we can envisage, perhaps like Mr. Sailesh, we have to look forward. It's a cause for concern. Are we going to go through globalization or protectionism? How do we challenge Trans-Pacific Partnership? 16 countries, 7 odd years, continuous negotiations, enlisting a free trade. Now, still we have 1 year to endorse it by American Parliament. American Congress still has got 1 year time. But look at the gravity of the issues. Without America, TPP doesn't work. Why it was promoted? There was a purpose. You need to have free trade. While contentious issues are there between developed world and developing world in terms of trade, India itself has got issues which we need to manifest because we have extraordinary sort of reorganization required in our trade policies if you have to accept all the impositions which are required by WTO. That's contentious. As an emerging market like India has to have its own say. That's the part. The bigger picture is, how do we promote trade? How do we promote investments? How do we promote banking? How do we promote finance? How do we promote the global growth? How do we bring in national development agenda? How do we make sure global sustainability comes in? That's the purpose. If that is the case, if you look at the changes which are taking place in the world, it is cause for concern. It is cause for concern. The subsequent referendum in Italy, again, is a telling story. So we are at a crossroad. Mind you, financial economies still have to convert as real. Countries like India has done enormously well in the last 2 years. Looking at from external perspective, look at the today global investments, 1.7 trillion. Who is procuring it? The United States is number one, $384 billion. Who is number two? Hong Kong, $166 billion. Who is number three? Again, China, $133 billion. Who is number four? Netherlands, $90 billion. If you look at the rank, today India has moved to 7th position, where it was 3 years before. Think about it. We are in the right direction. You have to understand, over 70 billion has been the overall foreign direct investments, including the investable surplus accrued. If you look at the bigger picture, our market liberalization has worked. Our liberalization in terms of defense or railways, which the minister was mentioning, or for that matter, insurance or banking or single brand retail. These are pragmatic policies for you to integrate in line with the globe. How China, socialist-centered country, has converted because of the free market principles when it comes to business, that's distinct. You have to produce gross welfare to the mass. Peter, are you there? Peter, my head of Shanghai operations. How is the Chinese economy now? How is the business momentum there? Can you pass on the mic to this gentleman? You can hear from the horse's mouth. I've got 16 countries representatives sitting here. You can ask right from Australia to Toronto what sort of economic momentum going on. You can clarify during the dinner session as well. These are bankers, economists who understand the dynamics. How is the Chinese economy doing now? What sort of reorganization taking place in the Chinese economy?
So, okay. So basically, in China, there are also many changes in the banking sector. So we saw the narrowing of the net interest margin, and also the banks are investing heavily on the fin technology. So basically, some Chinese banks, they could approve a small loan to a personal or SME customers within 1 or 2 days because they are using high technology, and also they are relying on some data source to assist in their approval of the lending facilities. So I know that even with this quick approval, the NPL ratio is maintained at around 3 to 4%. So basically very efficient. And going forward, e-commerce will also be very rapid development because, as you know, Alibaba is a big e-commerce player in the world, so listed in US Stock Exchange. And in one single day, on 11th of November, we call it a special day. So basically, most of the sellers, they offer heavy discount on their B2C e-commerce platform. So on one single day, the total sales is around $16 billion. So it breaks many records. So most of the sales, not just in China, basically I know there are also many significant sales to countries like Russia. So basically and also now in China, basically whenever you have your mobile phone, we can buy breakfast, we can buy newspaper, and also we can pay taxi fee via mobile phone. So basically, technology-wise, China is developing in a good shape, I would say. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And you met the gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, this is not premeditated. I have never spoken to them that I'm going to ask all these questions. There could be more questions to people around. The reason why I'm saying is it's a testimony for us to realize what sort of reorganization taking place in the global map. Today, China is investing in India, Indian Railways. You have seen the development. The minister was trying to see what sort of investment partnership evolving. Japan, Kanji, are you there? I was there last month. What's the development between India and Japan? Let's not talk about Japanese economy. I was there a couple of weeks before we had, and in fact, the Prime Minister was, Indian Prime Minister was there a week before my session on 16th of last month in Tokyo. What is the development between India and Japan in the last 2 years?
Okay, let me explain about the general economic situation in Japan first of all anyway. Japan's economy has been making steady growth, not too significant, but GDP growth has been growing just like 1.5%, just like that. And Japanese business is overall speaking safe, I can say that. And BOJ, Bank of Japan, is trying to achieve inflation 2%, and BOJ has introduced negative interest policy from the beginning of this year. And inflation target 2% has not been achieved, and negative interest policy is still on trial stage. That is a general sort of point, economic points from Japan. And India, there has been sort of a constant trade, just like export-import. Each, I understand that 7 billion or 8 billion, yeah, for both sides, steady trade volumes. And also, as you know, Japanese government and Japanese companies are involved in a high-speed railway project. That is a quite mega project in India. And Japan, economic ties between India and Japan are quite strong, and there are many, many opportunities created by Japan and India. And the Doha Bank would like to contribute on such opportunities. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. It is an amazing relationship between Japan and India. The chemistry between the two prime ministers has been extraordinary for us to see, but some of the deals are transgressing beyond economic impact. It is going to have extraordinary value advantage, this bilateral partnership. That's what I am trying to see. And plenty of initiatives have been taken. I mean, the bigger opportunity lies if you recognize international economics is all about building collaborations, value-driven partnership. And that's what precisely we need to move. From domestic-centric, we have to move for attracting foreign direct investments. You need to bring in, improve the competitiveness. We have to improve the business climate. You have to liberalize the marketplace, and you have to ensure that governance comes in and transparency comes in. These are not ordinary issues. Then only you can integrate yourself. If you look at the global space, the changes which are happening, which are changes which are happening in India, it's a very important opportunity for us to cash in. Now, for a minute, I'll talk about the financial markets. The reason why I have to bring in financial market is the changes which are happening in the global scene is directly impacting the trade. A trade war is nothing but a currency war. If you understand the dynamics between currencies and commodities, you have reasons to believe they are interconnected and interdependent. When I said about oil price, $100 have regressed to $26 in the year beginning. It's not necessarily because of demand and supply alone. When oil was $147, it is not the demand was exponential. It is oil futures, speculation again. When dollar was weak, people hedged the risk by buying commodity futures. When dollar is weak, we hedge the risk by buying commodity futures. I have got a foreign exchange expert, Mr. Parak, who's a great financial controller. And I used to learn from him when I was auditing his company 30-odd years before. Foreign exchange is all about interconnected. When it comes to functional management, you look at the currencies as well as commodities. And that is precisely happening in the market today. Why today Japan is looking at yen, weakening yen, simply because they are export-driven. If you look at a dollar index today, 102.8, how can you manufacture products? Today, world import, if you look at it in tandem, 20% of the world import is America. The consumption is also high. 12% of the world export is America. If you want to have manufacturing as your principle-centered objectives, you should not have strong dollar. Strong dollar, weakening rest of the currencies. You look at the currency impact in the rest of the alignment. Euro is down, very much down. Pound is down. And again, Japanese yen has touched 117, 118. These are direct impact in a globalized world. What's happening in one part of the world resonates. What's happening in one functional market has got direct implication in the interconnected of the other market. Stocks and interest rates are interconnected. Currencies and commodities are interconnected. And that's what exactly the reflection we are seeing today with the lack of convergence in terms of politics and economics. We have seen financial markets have become gambling grounds. It defies all the logic, underlying logics. Where is the logic for you to recognize today Brazil, which is contracted by 3.5%, has gone up in terms of stocks 43%. Russian economy, which is again a contraction, has gone up by 37% in terms of year-to-date growth. Nifty, look at it, less than 2% growth in spite of your economic momentum. The reason why we need to articulate all this is to recognize where the opportunity comes in. If this is the world picture, we talked about Japan, we talked about China, we talked about the global advanced economies, we talked about emerging markets. Where is the opportunity comes from? What sort of partnership you and me have to develop? How do we make sure sustainability comes in for your business model? And that's what the purpose of the session, right? If that is the case, look at it from a Gulf perspective. And again, I'm not here to sell Gulf or Doha Bank. The purpose of the session is to recognize there are bigger opportunities coming up. As long as you have pragmatic policies coming out of the policy, from the policymakers, and you as a businessman recognize opportunities exist in the world. Now, coming to the Gulf, today, Gulf states are now moving, as I mentioned, from hydrocarbon to non-hydrocarbon. If you look at, in aggregate terms, 6 states put together, diversification of structured solutions, investable surplus has been accumulated over $2.3 trillion. How much? 1/3 of the global sovereign funds is from the Gulf. 6 states. 2.3 trillion out of 6.9 trillion. It could be Abu Dhabi investment authorities, it could be Saudi, it could be Kuwait investment authorities, it could be Qatar investment authorities. That is where the Prime Minister was focusing here. He was in Saudi, he was in Abu Dhabi, he took a commitment of 75 billion. Again, he was in Qatar this June, asking for investments. The Prime Minister, not only that, His Highness, the Emir of Qatar was here in June, rather March last year. In this year, June, the Prime Minister of India was there in Gulf. I had a privilege of being part of the delegation. And again, the Prime Minister of Qatar was here 2 weeks before in Delhi. I was also part of the delegation. The reason why I'm saying this is a change in market preference. If you look at the bigger picture, today, when they are moving from hydrocarbon to non-hydrocarbon, it means airport, seaport, road, rail, infrastructure creations, 7 to 8% aggregate growth. Who can do it? We have invested as India, as a country, human capital. We have proximity. And the kind of opportunity you have and the economic fundamentals these countries have got, whether it is small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, whether it is big corporates, it is not only L&T, Voltas, or Shapoorji Pallonji, or Punch Lloyd. There are hundreds of Indian corporates can come to the Gulf. If you look at the small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, you have bigger opportunities because cost of capital is cheaper, you have cost-effective labor, you have tax holidays, you have tax incentives if you establish over a period of time. And also, as bankers, it's easy for me to lend for SMEs simply because I am partially guaranteed by the sovereign authorities. Qatar Development Bank, for example, guarantees 87% of my SME lending. 87% of my lending is guaranteed as long as a joint risk validation comes in between QDB, Qatar Development Bank, and Doha Bank, small and medium-sized entrepreneurs will be supported in terms of debt. There are possibilities of mezzanine financing or seed capital if you have a know-how which is responsive. So, doing business in the Gulf is an opportunity, and that's what we want you to do. We want you to recognize whether a debt or equity, you have bigger opportunity to cash in the Gulf states. Today, there's an absolute bilateral trade taking place between the Gulf states and India. You know how much is the number? Over $100 billion. $100 billion is a bilateral trade. Do you know how many Indians are living in the Gulf? 7.5 million Indians. Do you know how much investments are likely to come with the commitment which the current Prime Minister of India has mobilized in the last 2 years within the 4 states? Over 200 billion. These are to be built in with proper feasibility, proper investment partnership, proper joint venture with proper economic momentum. And that's precisely the collaboration model which we have as an opportunity. If you look at the project space in the Gulf states, this year alone, 6 states put together, the total tender release was $41 billion for various reasons which I mentioned. Qatar is going to host 2022, as the Minister has mentioned. Dubai is going to do 2020 Expo. If you look at the projects which are in the pipeline between the Gulf states, as I mentioned, for the reasons why they have fiscal deficit, expansionary fiscal policy, 176 billion is the likely tender for next year. That is why I call upon all the Indian corporates, whether you're big or small or medium, you have an opportunity to recognize, and you can cash in if you set up your infrastructure there. There is enough economic fundamentals. These countries, most of them are AA rated. Countries like Qatar is AA rated, UAE is AA rated, Kuwait is AA rated. If you set up as a global gateway in these countries, your cost of capital becomes cheaper, cost of borrowings becomes cheaper. And if you have existing business, you should explore the possibility of setting up in the free zone or specified zones where there are incentives, where market liberalization is supportive. And with the cost-effective labor which you can import, it is easy for you to do business. And that is your gateway for global business. Whether you run a local business or not, today you are living in a globalized environment. And you have to be cost competitive. Today's world is competitive world. If you recognize why India could not export more, because our interest rate was high, our financing charges were high, our inflation was high. That's getting reversed on the one side. If you combine with the hybrid model of setting up your infrastructure in the Gulf and collaborating value-driven partnership in succinct terms, you have bigger opportunity to grow. And that is precisely the purpose of the session I thought it's appropriate to bring in. I can still outline the details in tandem, but on account of shortage of time, I thought it's appropriate to bring in the highlights of the overall changing dynamics. There is definite opportunity for the changing market opportunities which you can seize in. You have an economy which is driven by very strong economic fundamentals. You have proximity and human capital in the Gulf, and right collaborations, right kind of investment partnership, right kind of joint venture can take you places. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.